Well, a warm welcome to everyone. I'm James. I'm one of the lucky moderators here for this amazing Lifting the Lid festival, and thank you to Victoria and Joe for this amazing project and several years down the line. So thank you both very much for the amazing work and inspiration that you do, and to everyone who's joining us here tonight at 10 o'clock in the UK, and then 5 in the
5
afternoon.
p.m. Yeah,
5, 5,
5 p.m.
5 p.m. with you. Well, truly beautifully international. Okay, well, lovely. Just to say, we are recording this session. Dan is recording it, and we'll see it at some stage in the future. If everyone's all right for that, you can obviously turn your screen so you won't be seen if you don't want to. Yes, this workshop, Elise, is being recorded. You can yeah, absolutely. So we'll try to get it out there at some stage in the future. Definitely. Lovely. Yeah. Brilliant. So without further ado, I'll just introduce you, Dan. So Dan is a film scholar as well as a professor, and this session is a professor in the Department of Film and Media, Queen's University in lovely Canada. And this session is about introducing us all to this app that you've created, Dan, Letterboxd, as
Oh,
well
I
as
haven't, sorry, I haven't created it, but I use it and I advocate for it. Sorry. To
absolutely.
clarify.
As I was saying that, I thought I should have asked that, but
It's okay.
anyway, it's a collaboratively generated list of films that can be referenced when seeking media material on representations of death, dying, and grief. And Dan is going to introduce some key titles and then invite us all to share our own recommendations. And this list is an ongoing exercise with contributions from the last 3 years of this amazing festival. And I'm a filmmaker, so I haven't yet gone into the waters of this, but I know some of these films, and I'm very excited to be here, Dan. So over to you, and please put questions in the chat, and I can ask. If you have any questions, please put question at the start of it, and then we can pick those up, and you can pop on your camera when that comes, and the slides will morph into a Q&A session with Dan. So thank you, Dan. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, James and Victoria. Thank you so much for your work at getting this sheer amount of work on the ground and lifted and happening right now. And thank you, all of you, for your time and joining me today as we talk about death and grief on screen. My name is Dan Vena, as James introduced me. I'll give a visual description of myself. I have brown hair with a receding hairline that's kicking in, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I have a brown beard. I'm wearing a blue button-down top, and I'm sitting in front of a fairly beige background. So just a bit of context about who I am and how I'm approaching today's talk. Here we are. So I am a scholar in the Film and Media Department at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, otherwise known as Cataraqui. Cataraqui, or Kingston, Ontario, is situated in Treaty 57 territory, which is the home of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. And in case you have any questions or you want to hear more information about the films I used to teach with or the films I work with, my email is dan.vena@queensu.ca, and you are more than welcome to reach out to me, send me an email. I've had wonderful collaborations through this Lifting the Lid event over the years, so I'm really happy to hear from participants. A bit of a background about me. I'm actually a horror scholar by training, and I really, really resisted inundating you with horror films today that I think help us think about death and and grief in really interesting ways. Victoria was reminding me that the first iteration I did of this presentation with Lifting the Lid was definitely more horror focused. And I do quite advocate for the utility of horror, even though people might dismiss it. But I've tried to be good, and I've tried to kind of branch out with today's talk and give a few more other different types of films. As well, in terms of my background, I've received some death doula training through Alua Arthur with Going with Grace, and I was able to go to Arizona for a 5-day long training there. It was wonderful. And even though I'm not necessarily practicing or looking to practice as a death doula, I could certainly say that my training there has informed how I approach films and representations of death and dying on screen. In terms of the scholarship I try to produce, I'm really interested in images of death, the macabre, and the perverted or the deviant. So I've done work on like medical histories of trans bodies, monster movies, and I'm starting to now go into death on screen. So I like to say to people, my syllabi are filled with monsters, queers, and corpses, and they often end up being either fan favorite courses by like the select few, or have students really questioning who I am by the end of it and why I have such proclivities. I've had one student was very cordially said to me once, Dan, what is this all about? And I was like, I know, I have a particular interest, and I tried to explain it as being interested in that which society doesn't want us to acknowledge, the things that go unspoken, and how we could use art to speak of these things. And I should also credit that today's presentation has been assisted by an MA research student, Jade Korchesny, who presented with me last year, and whose research continues to inform some of the selections today. All right, so getting into it now, I just wanted to make sure that for everybody, if you feel like I'm speaking too softly or I'm speaking too quickly, feel free to drop in the chat a quick note to James, and he could flag me down and let me know. As well, I believe now Zoom has like a zoom in feature, so if my font is a bit too small, you could click onto the screen presentation and actually zoom in and pop it up bigger if you need to. At least I could do that on my version, and hopefully on your version. Victoria's giving me the shake. My version allows me to do that, but perhaps not on other ones. So that is something out there, hopefully. All right. So what are today's goals? We're going to try to make this fairly brief. We have 40 minutes together. I'm going to share films that could help us on our journey of death acceptance, death literacy, and death positivity. And I'm going to be talking about this app Letterbox that is a nice way of organizing the films you engage with, and also sharing lists of films with like a book club or a film club, or just folks that you want to be in conversation with about these topics. I'll present just a few kind of favorite examples that I've been thinking about recently and that I've been thinking about using in the classroom that I have been finding productive, or I hope to find productive. And then the last little bit of the time we spend together will be about inviting participation and your own thoughts and reflections about art and films that you've found particularly inspiring, because as James mentioned at the beginning of this talk, I really want this list to be a collaborative endeavor or effort. And I really would like to put as many kind of thoughts and ideas from others as I can into the list. So that said, a few kind of a bit of context about the list, how I went about generating it, and what is and is not there. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list of all the films one could use to talk about death and grief and aging and mortality and death anxiety on screen. It's just been over the years the films that have kind of percolated in my mind, as well as the people I work with and the students I interact with. And some of the entries, as you'll see, were posts from the Lifting the Lid Instagram account and from previous participants. I'm not necessarily, as a researcher or a thinker or as a presenter today, concerned with more like anthropological or sociological approaches to films. So like selecting films that would show us what a particular type of community or people, how they navigate death, aging, grief, funerary practices. I'm a little less literal, I think, in my thinking, although it's not to discount those types of approaches. And as James kind of called me out on when we were preparing for this talk, I do have a bias towards narrative filmmaking. I don't have a lot of documentaries as a part of this list. And we could certainly get into that as to why. But that's a bit because of my own training is in narrative films. And also that, again, I'm kind of trying to think about this in a very not literal sense of just characters dying on screen, but films that help us get to other aspects of death positivity or death anxiety, and specifically films that promote us to look at our relationship with our bodies, these vessels that will eventually no longer be. And so that is kind of where I'm going with some of my thoughts today, and what I mean by kind of films that push conventional boundaries regarding representations of death. So I'm not only talking about, I guess, literal deaths on screen. As well, I actually think film is a fascinating medium to think about in terms of death literacy, death positivity, and how art can make a contribution to these conversations. Because death and film are really set up nicely with one another. A very famous film scholar, Andre Bazin, essentially offers film as kind of a mummification process. He talks about this complex, this mummy complex that is fulfilled by film. And he kind of talks about there are certain art forms, the plastic arts, things like photography, cinema, painting, that really aim at survival, cheating death by reproducing bodies. And so he was thinking about cinema as almost an entombment or embalming process where we can enshrine somebody's image and preserve it for throughout time. And there's even more to be said about this theory or this idea of cinema as a mummification process or an embalming process. But Bazin even had this theory that the filmic image, is itself equivalent to the real object in which it represents. And he makes this beautiful, beautiful argument that literally the light particles that hit my body and that are captured on the analog celluloid strip are the same. And so the recreation of that light is essentially what allows him to think about the filmic image as the same as the real object in which it captured. And there's a lot more to be said, like about dense theories of cinema with that, but I just wanted to kind of give it or offer it as an idea of thinking about how film is really a wonderfully set up mechanism to think about these things. Another reason why film is so wonderfully set up to think about death, dying, aging, etc., is that it's very mimetic. There are some films in particular that through watching them, we replicate the sensations on screen. And again, I'm biased towards horror, but there are lots of different other ones like melodrama, for instance. But we often will experience the same physical responses as characters might experience on screen. And cinema reminds us of our embodiment in the world, that we're experiencing a state of corporeality, of being in the body. And so there are certain films that might trigger that response more than others, and we could get to a few of those in a moment. The other thing is that cinema is really well set up to think phenomenologically. And this is a bit of a new pathway in my own thinking, but essentially, phenomenology is a very complex theory to say the study of living, of being in the body, the study of experience. And for a number, well, for decades, if not centuries, the knowledge of the body has been superseded or de-hierarchicized over things like logic and the mind. And so we have, over time, especially in Western culture, delegitimized the knowledge the body gives to us and gives to the world. Phenomenology is all about trying to rectify that and trying to look at the body as itself a source of knowledge, instead of just thinking about knowledge as produced by a quote rational mind or produced in language or communication. That our body's sensorium itself hosts and holds important knowledge. And I think film could activate that and remind us of that in really important ways. So my recent thinking has kind of flowed as follows. What films might promote or encourage this phenomenological approach to knowledge? So how we understand and reflect on experiences as mediated by the body. And selfishly, I come to you today preparing to teach for the very first time an entire course dedicated to death on screen. It'll be a fourth-year course that I offer in the winter term at my university. And I'm trying to think of titles that could help engage 21, 22-year-olds in thinking about their own corporeal reality, their own existence in a body, which will eventually cease. And at 21 and 22, it is very hard for them, and they articulate that it's hard for them to think about this. It's even hard for them to think about aging as an upcoming reality for them. And so I'm trying to maybe selfishly ask you if you have any thoughts or suggestions of films that could be possibly incorporated into this educational experience. So some of the things that were considered for how I and Jade and others helped generate this list of films that I'll talk about in a moment, I was thinking about select themes, so things like corporal death, so the death of the body. I was thinking about social death and necropolitics, how certain bodies are susceptible to violence and death, or how certain bodies in Western society and culture are kind of seen as collateral damage to things like capitalism, white supremacy, heteronormativity, etc. Uh, Topics of aging were certainly part of the list. Questions of mortality or grappling with mortality, experiences of the body or being in a body, and the idea of leaving a legacy or an artifact or creating something that could be tangibly held in memory of you. So those were kinds of things that I was percolating as I was generating the list. Now, the list itself appears on Letterboxd, and this is for some of you who don't know Letterboxd, an introduction. It's an app you could put on your phone. It's also a website you could use in your browser, and it is so very handy for keeping track of the things you watch and the things you like and your response to them, but also can be used as a way to generate lists for your book club. Well, I keep saying book club, but film club or book club that uses film some weeks. And I wanted to introduce it because I think some people are aware of it, but some people aren't. And I wanted to make sure we were all kind of on the same page with accessing this list. So this is what you'll find on the homepage of Letterboxd once you make an account and start generating some content there. So this is my own account, and clearly you can see my username if you want to look me up. So if you go to the account there, your own account, you'll see a drop-down menu, and it'll give you lots of options of things you can explore on the page and on the app. But one of the greatest features of Letterboxd that a lot of people use it for is this diary feature, which enables you to record when you watched a film, how or what you thought about the film when you watched it, take notes when you watched it, etc. So you could see I'm actually getting over a bit of a nasty cold. And so you could see my viewing habits when I have a cold are very true crime related. I have a very complicated relationship to true crime, but I do find it's that bizarre self-soothing mechanism when I'm sick. And you could also see that my wife and I watched a Hallmark Christmas movie last night. So this just helps you kind of keep track of the things that you are encountering. If you're like me, you might watch a lot of things and not remember the things you've seen. So this is a really helpful way to keep track of it. The other function, which is kind of what we're using it for in this presentation, is that it enables you to make lists or to see other people's lists that have been made on topics that you want to search. So here is our updated list for today. It's if you were to go to the website and search death and grief on screen, you'd see these options pop up, and you want to click the option that's for 2024. It's the updated version of this list. And once you click on that, you'll be able to see our description of the list and some of the films that are populated in it. Now, not every list will have this, but we've added reading notes for every entry just to give like super brief context as to why those films were selected and why they appear on the list. So if you were to click that little button, read notes, you'd see all these little notes pop up and help kind of contextualize the selection of the film. Some of the films are from myself, my MA student Jade. Others were taken from the Lifting the Lid Instagram account, and others were simply sent into us by Lifting the Lid attendees. And all of that has been recorded in the list. By the time I ended up getting ready for this presentation, I had about 50 titles or so, and I'm hoping we could generate even more. So in terms of what films I've found particularly useful in talking about death, dying, grief, aging, being in the body, one of the films I find really helpful in doing this is actually a film that in no death appears at all. It's a documentary, fairly recent, called Free Solo, and it follows an American climber whose goal it is to climb a particularly treacherous peak of Yosemite Mountain without any climbing or safety equipment. So that's the name. Free solo climbing means to climb with literally nothing else but your shoes and your chalk bag. And people often are like, but why would you start with this film? And I actually think this is a film that you cannot watch. It's a film that provokes a corporal embodied experience. Like you can't watch this film and not have kind of a response, a physiological response to the imagery you're seeing. Here he is, Alex Honnold, on Yosemite Mountain with no safety equipment whatsoever, doing a bit of an overhang climb. And when you watch this full documentary, you are certainly experiencing physiological responses. And it's a great film to remind us that we are in our bodies. I think part of death education, death literacy, is the reminder that we exist in a body. Under capitalism and modernity, there are a lot of ways in which we've become divorced from our body, the needs of our body, and are trained to actively ignore the sensorium of our body. So I feel like getting back to that knowledge is part of the journey of death literacy and thinking and talking about death. When I showed this to a book club that was looking at books about death, we did this screening together. Other things that came up were conversations about the purpose of life. Why would somebody want to do this with their life? Why would somebody want to pursue this type of activity? What makes a good life? And how can we honor everybody's kind of intent in those ways? But also, a lot of the participants who are women were saying it was a fascinating documentary to see the lengths a white man will go to experience fear. And I think there is like a little bit of humor, obviously, in that sentiment, but it is true that this is quite an extreme degree of chasing that thrill that Alex Honnold has to go to. And there is some talk whether that is a kind of neurological experience for him, that he's perhaps wired differently. But we did have really beautiful and meaningful conversations about the gendered experiences or differences of fear and how that leads to living different kind of lives and pursuing different activities. If documentary is your thing, and James, again, this is to speak to you, another documentary you could pair Free Solo with if you wanted to do a double bill is Fantastic Fungi. Again, it is not ever, there's no death shown on screen, but it does remind us of the connectivity of our bodies to the world in which, the land in which we inhabit. It's a beautiful documentary that shows the power of the mushroom. But what I walked away from it was more so how all of us are implicated in these environments and how we again need to restore a particular knowledge of the body. Going ahead, The Substance has taken kind of the world by storm, or at least Western cinema by storm. It is a film, it's a body horror film that is using kind of incredibly graphic imagery to meditate on aging, celebrity culture, and essentially the value of women under capitalism. And that, of course, you lose your kind of social value as you age. This is a film that students have really connected with, and others, like my mother, for instance, really connected with this film as well. And I thought it was particularly moving and powerful for the way in which the body is visualized as decaying and eventually deteriorating. Because it is so fantastic, yes, it perhaps doesn't really look like an aging body, but it certainly calls us to think about that process of deterioration. If you wanted to pair it with something, another suggestion from a previous year was a horror film called Titan that also has a very fantastical approach to the destruction of the body, but is beautifully handled, in which the destruction of one body leads to the birth of a new one. And it is quite a wild ride if you are willing to go on it. Very gender bending, queer, graphic, and tonally treads the line between drama and horror to comedy in a really brilliant way. But if you're looking for a kind of campier pairing to The Substance, you could go back to an oldie but a goodie, which is Death Becomes Her. Certainly a like a fan favorite about aging and beauty cultures. But The Substance really made me ended up thinking about this beautiful quote that I love from Kristeva, from Julia Kristeva, who's a French feminist philosopher. She was writing about the grotesque and the abject in the 1970s. And she reminds us that we will all abject ourselves at one point. We will no longer cease to be in the world. And she writes, "It is no longer I who expel, I is expelled." And I think we get a kind of visualization of that process, beautifully done in The Substance. Carrying on, this is one that might not necessarily seem to fit in this list, but I think has been a really shockingly death positive film to think about. Barbie starts, like the entire crisis of the Barbie film starts when Barbie asks, "Do you guys ever think about dying?" And this essentially brings a cataclysmic halt to the euphoric and utopian happiness of Barbie in her own world. The film has been kind of championed amongst people online, especially on TikTok and Instagram, as helping us to reflect about death avoidance in our culture and death anxiety. But also, if you were to search Barbie and death positivity, you would come up with some wonderful kind of wonderful documentation about people saying that it helped them connect to religion in really beautiful ways, because it shows an image of somebody meeting their creator, and the creator being a benevolent, loving, and forgiving figure. And that is an image that has resonated with people who perhaps grew up in a religious community in which that is not the image of the creator. So this has kind of been taken up in really diverse ways and has really helped generate conversation. We don't have time for it, but one TikToker called Death Curious did a whole 4-part series of this, explaining kind of death positivity in Barbie, and it was indeed liked by whoever is looking after the Lifting the Lid Instagram account. So it's a thumbs up in this community. Other films to think about. I wanted to bring up very quickly Chocolate Babies as a film that has one that I always advocate for. I think I've brought it up almost every year I've been here. It's a very underappreciated, little known film that was created during the AIDS crisis in the United States and centers on a group of queer, mostly Black or racialized individuals as they essentially identify themselves as a terrorist activist group who is raining hell on the streets of New York, and specifically to politicians who are denying or halting access to life-saving drugs and medication and care during the AIDS crisis. The film itself is very complicated in terms of how individuals are expressing their anger and grief, but it has this beautiful moment of a living funeral in which all the characters gather around and prepare themselves to say goodbye to one of their friends. And it is a beautiful fictional snapshot of some of the mutual aid and community care that was happening during the AIDS crisis. This film, you can't buy it on DVD or Blu-ray, but I believe the filmmaker still has it up online if you want to watch it. And I highly recommend it as just a beautiful moment or a beautiful representation of a horrific moment in time. As well, to speak on that, if you're interested on kind of representations of death, dying during the AIDS crisis, ACT UP has an oral history project that has archived a lot of the political funerals and these kind of community aid moments that happened, and they're all available online for you to watch as well. Flipping ahead, this will be the last film I talk about because I know we're tight on time today. Beau Travail has been one that has haunted me since my own undergraduate training. It is a film by French filmmaker Claire Denis and has what I think is perhaps one of the greatest villainous deaths in cinema history, a character who we've grown very fond of, but has done very horrifying things. And the death he is given in this film matches the kind of beautiful yet horrifying context in which the film is set. This film focuses on a group of French legionnaires in Djibouti, Africa, after Djibouti has gained independence from being a French colony. So they are the bodies of imperialism left over, and they serve no purpose anymore in the sense of empire building. And so the film is what happens to these bodies that have been expelled from empire making, but serve no purpose on the land in which they are. And so we have this kind of specter of death and colonialism haunting the very landscape of the film, haunting its narrative action, but also the film culminates in this death sequence that has stayed in my mind for like I guess a decade now. It's well more than a decade, and I really highly recommend it. If you want to keep thinking about the specters of colonialism and haunting, I'd also recommend films like Rhymes for Young Ghouls or His House, which have very kind of literalized those specters of colonialism. You could call them horror films. I think they're horror thriller-esque, but they're profound in their kind of treatment of these topics. I know I blazed through that. Those were just some of my recommendations, and now I realize I should have selected an hour presentation instead of 45 minutes. But any thoughts or questions on films that have inspired these types of conversations, or even some of your own suggestions of films that could go on our list as we keep building and sharing our thoughts with one another?
I know Meredith had a few thoughts earlier on in the chat. Do you want to bring them up?
Sure. Would love to.
You're welcome, Meredith, to put your audio on and ask that, or I can scroll back and find some of those thoughts.
I can try with my audio. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I'm
great.
sorry, I'm leaving my video off only because my internet's a little bit patchy and having the video off kind of helps. Dan, that was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, and I'm going to try and think of some titles to maybe send your way for the list. Now, my comments were about kung fu movies, which I dearly love, and that always surprises people because I'm this kind of quiet, gentle, introverted female, but I love them to death. And oh, pun unintended. And I guess my comment was that it's a very gory genre. It always has lots of death, but one thing that fascinates me about martial arts movies is that the emotional, psychological, even social energies of the characters are embodied and shown to us, demonstrated to us in these beautiful, intricate choreographed sequences. And also in terms of death, of which there is a lot, but we're shown again choreographically attitudes around the deaths that you see about who is worthy, who is unworthy, who is heroic, who is pitiful, uh, you know, where does vengeance sit with all of that? So yeah, I guess I was just riffing off the top of my
Yeah.
head when I wrote that, but thank you for a
I
wonderful
love that.
presentation.
I love that contribution. And it fits so nicely into kind of those thoughts I was having of can we expand what we consider like these categories of death on screen to mean something more than just kind of films that show characters dying. And I taught I used a martial arts film in one of the courses I recently taught. And I'm thinking of the film Hero in particular as just like this beautiful, gorgeous film. But if that is up your alley and you're interested in films, you, Meredith, or others, both Travai also actually was choreographed. The military training sequences were choreographed by a ballet choreographer, so they don't quite look like military sequences. They're very kinetic, very exploratory, very homoerotic, and it is part of why I find this film so haunting because it is so much about where the energy of the body goes when life has no purpose anymore. Like, where do you put that kinetic energy? And I can't say enough good things about this film, but hopefully maybe that speaks to some of the thoughts or overlaps with some of the thoughts you were having about the martial arts films. Just looking through here.
Lucia, did you want to research the cancertainment and have some film and TV suggestions series here? With a just to throw a brilliant presentation, Dan. You've sent me certainly spinning in so many directions, and also going back to that sense of documentary. There is a whole subset of climbing documentaries, and particularly wasn't there a body found recently of, was it Sherpa Tenzing, I think was found recently. There's a whole kind of genre of documentaries that look at that. What pushes the human psyche in with that particular threat, is that the right word, or pushing? I can't remember what you said, but also the work of Derek Jarman. I'll send you
Yep.
some
Yeah.
who again pushed narratives, and his extraordinary film Blue, which is just
Yep.
an hour and a half of blues, of gradations of blue screen, around again, the AIDS crisis, and Jarman's living through that, and sadly dying far too young on that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And I kind of really skipped over it. But another film I had kind of thinking about the AIDS crisis in a way that draws attention to the crisis, but doesn't quite dramatize it in a literal sense would be Todd Haynes's Safe. for people who are looking to re-enter this moment and to also think about the vulnerability of the body. Safe essentially projects its threat through Julianne Moore's character, who's growing increasingly allergic and sensitive to her environment as she goes. And she's taking increased precautions to feel safe in her environment. But nothing really helps. So that's another film that to me kind of came up where it's like, how do we handle these horrific moments of mass death? And Safe is a really interesting metaphor for playing through that. And Blue is a great entry into that as well. The other thing I should say is documentary has been helpful in my classes, even though I said I'm biased against it. The other film I didn't mention here, but I can for those interested, is The Act of Seeing with One's Own Eye. It's by Stan Brakhage, and it's his documentary of autopsies being performed in a morgue. It brings up a lot of questions about ethics and consent, namely that none of the families of the deceased knew that this was happening, and also that some of the deceased did not necessarily have families that were claiming them. But it does meditate a lot on the filmmaker's own relationship to death and dying. And I found students, and frankly, anybody who watches it, you can't not have a response to what you're seeing because it is so clinical, so devoid of emotionality, and presents the human body in this kind of very detached way, that it does spark a lot of thought and conversation, and has been, in terms of documentary, the most, I think, useful one I've played in this type of setting. It's incredibly graphic, though, for anybody who wants to see it, like incredibly graphic.
Ashley's got your hand up.
Hi there. Yeah. I've always been curious about using films and TV to kind of make people more comfortable having conversations about death, particularly when we're talking to like our loved ones about what their plans are and they go, "Oh, I don't want to talk about that." Because we will sit in a movie theater or on our couch and watch something that is death heavy, whether it's horror or action or even a drama. So do you have any sort of ideas about how we can use films and TV to sort of start those conversations in a way that makes people more comfortable?
Yeah, I was thinking about TV too, because there's lots of TV that's like explicit about death and dying, things like The Good Place, Dead Like Me, 6 Feet Under. There's like a whole string of that stuff. But I also found that I was having a lot of death anxiety and conversations about death by watching something like Game of Thrones that I found incredibly useful for myself and
Okay.
could be for others, in the sense that it creates a world in which life is so precious and could be snuffed out so quickly for so many reasons. It gives a great fragility to the life of the characters, especially for those who haven't seen Game of Thrones. They kill anybody you're attached to. There are no rules in Game of Thrones. And so you will cultivate love and attachment for people who will die in a blink of an eye, and there's no glamorization of it either. It's like, nope, they're dead, moving on, right? So it's like there are types of shows, and Game of Thrones to me is the biggest one, that treat death in a very matter of fact way that I found helpful for thinking about, like, is this not what we are all doing in some regard? Like, yes, we don't live in a fantastical world of lights and whatever, but is death not always haunting us? And isn't it always both spectacular and mundane at the same time? And that's kind of how the show treats it. So I kind of would feel like finding media that works for the loved ones around you. And I'm super happy to brainstorm with you, Ashley. Like, hey, I'd like to bring up conversations with my loved ones, and they like X. They like these types of things. I'm more than happy to brainstorm with you thoughts of how we could start that together.
Oh, fantastic. I really appreciate that. It's actually funny because my boyfriend is in the other room watching Game of Thrones right now. So
There you go.
that's
So yeah, it's
really,
perfect.
really on the nose there. But yeah, thank you for answering that. I just, not even just for myself, but as, an end of life planner, doula, person for just encouraging those conversations. So yeah, I would
Yeah,
love to brainstorm something like that with you because
that's
I think
great.
it can be really helpful for people, especially when things like Game of Thrones are so big and everybody watches them, and it's, you know, I guess it, yeah, like you said, it kind of shows the fragility of things in a way that people are taking in regularly. So thank you for
Yeah,
that.
and it's a good question too, because I feel like that's kind of why I'm pushing this idea of, can we create a list in which it's not just about death and dying per se on screen, but evokes the same anxieties and existential thoughts by seeing these types of images. Hence, like my thought about Free Solo. Mind the slides going very fast. I apologize, but hence why I start usually these conversations with Free Solo, because you cannot ignore your body in this film, and you cannot ignore the fragility and vulnerability of the body in this film. So it's a great comment. So thank you, Ashley, for provoking that.
And I hate to be the person that sort of says we have to round up to I'm really sorry because I'm so enjoying it, but we just have to round up for the next session. But if people want to contact you, is that okay? Yeah, that's
Yes,
fine.
please. And if James, maybe you could send me some of the thoughts that are in the chat, because I think once I leave, I will not have access to the chat anymore.
You able to save that, James? Is that?
Just remind me.
You go to the. I mean, I have saved it, but you go to the three at the top of the chat box. You go to the three dots, and then save chat.
Can't see
Don't
those
worry.
now, but you've got them.
Oh, I've got it. Yeah, I can save it. Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you. And thank you everybody for your contributions. I will update the list, and you are free to share as you need.
Next year you have to have 2 hours.
Thank you for such a rich, joyous, stimulating. Yeah, only just getting started in my brain. Firing on. So thank you very much, Dan. Indeed.